This video, I'm going to cover the first in a series of things to help develop your investing narrative. I always start very big picture and then kind of work my way into the investing and trading philosophy that I use or methods that I use. So, um, the economic theories that have transpired over time and even to today are a melting pot of different theories, especially today. Um, I never find somebody in modern economics that uh, totally is involved in one theory versus another. They may have a lean more in one direction, but there are no real purists per se because economics as a field of study is something that is a work in progress. Let's just say that. So let's start first with the very beginning of really economics in general, and that is in 1776 with Adam Smith and what most people will say is the beginning is a Wealth of Nations. And he when he wrote this book, free trade was not rampant. They had mercantilism, and it was built as such that a lot of countries would protect their goods. They didn't want to necessarily trade, but Adam Smith was an advocate of free trade. And he was also an advocate from that book of private property. And then he talked about, which a lot of people have heard of before, is the invisible hand. And what that references is the unintended greater society benefits that one that society gets basically while an individual seeks their own self-interest. So there's this kind of Gordon Gekko, greed is good type of thing. But it's classical economics is what it's referred to. Now, that was the beginning of this very like small types of things when you compare to how sophisticated economics has gotten today. It was very simple. And I think sometimes we make things more complicated. But in 1848, another view of things happened, and that was with Karl Marx and his economic theory in the Communist Manifesto. And this kind of presented a conflict between workers and property owners and the individual economic classes, if you will, kind of fighting against each other. And the Communist Manifesto was really kind of the counter to Adam Smith and his classical economics. And classical economics continued to get refined over a period of time. And from that emerged a book called The Principles of Economics by Alfred Marshall, and that was written in 1890. Alfred Marshall, in that book, talked a lot about supply and demand. That was the first introduction of that particular concept, and marginal utility. And then in the early 1900s, there was a lot of political and social unrest in the Soviet Union, and so there was an adoption basically of communism. And then we also know what followed basically from the early 1900s was the Great Depression all throughout pretty much the 1930s. And this is something that Adam Smith and Alfred Marshall didn't really address in their books and their philosophy, that there wasn't an answer to what you would do during the Great Depression. So this led to some new thinking coming about with regards to, in 1936, John Maynard Keynes, also referenced as Keynesians. And in his book, A General Theory of Money Theory and Employment, was basically that the government needed to get involved. And that now we're entering kind of government controlling the economy of a particular country. And that part of that job that the government has to do is not only help get a country out of something like a Great Depression, but that the government needed to be involved in creating demand. And so we've seen things like, we need to save companies, and there's a lot of macro modeling in the Keynesian model, in the Keynesian theory. And one of the biggest advocates today for that's really well known is Paul Krugman, and he writes for the New York Times, a number of other outlets. Then after 1936, and really even throughout the 20th century, you had socialism, and it's more of a political and economic type of theory. And for the most part, it's kind of developed into where you have markets that are out there, but the government is involved in regulation, ownership in industries, and public programs like something like universal health care. And that particular field is kind of really what you're going to see throughout Europe, different versions of it, obviously, that are being practiced today. Then the Austrians. Well, actually, the book for Austrians was written in 1871, and it, just like Alfred Marshall, The Principles of Economics was the name of the book. So we have two principles of economics, one by Alfred Marshall in 1890, and in 1871, Karl Menger wrote The Principles of Economics. Now, the Austrian school is more along the lines of probably what Adam Smith envisioned, and that private property and free markets is the way to go, and that basically you have tampering by the government with monetary policy and spending and doing things that they shouldn't be involved in. And so they wanted basically free markets. They want free markets to prevail, as well as private property. And they believe that the government and monetary policy, by virtue of their tampering with money and spending and things of that sort, make things worse. And that the economy, again, a belief of the Austrians, that the economy is too complex to really run experiments. So, in philosophy, you have a priori types of reasoning, and that's kind of what they go with. That they're thinking in terms of that math and statistics, although there's data there, it's not useful in economics. And so they want to use reasoning and actually looking at individual human behavior as kind of what you need to be getting in touch with about what the economy is, and that there are so many things. It's almost like weather. Why can't we get weather forecast perfectly? Well, we can't get weather forecast perfectly because there's so many variables, and if one little variable moves just a little bit, it could change your weather prediction. And so they believe that you can't really predict economics the way that the Keynesians did. And so Keynesians have lots of models and data, and they try to make it very empirical and run scientific method types of things. And the Austrians just really don't buy into that. And nor do they look at things in a macro and micro world. They don't even use those words. So those were those are kind of the characteristics, I guess, of the Austrian school. And as I've studied the Austrian school, it is something I wasn't taught in college. Everything was Keynesian. I mean, or some variation of Keynesian. So the Austrian school was something new to me, and I'd say in the last decade that I really understood how it works and the importance of it. And it was probably longer than a decade, but the Austrian school is one that very vocal people, Ron Paul, we had Karl Menger, who originally wrote the book Principles of Economics, but you got Friedrich Hayek, you've got Ludwig von Mises, and then currently you have other people, but Peter Schiff, who is pretty active on YouTube and used to show up on TV quite a bit until he started. I guess, made some people mad or upset about some of his thinking. And then we enter Milton Friedman and the Chicago School of Economics. And he borrowed some from the Austrian school, but he advocated for less government, less regulation, but he didn't completely eliminate the need for government. He would not be what I would call a pure Austrian economist, I guess, from my viewpoint. And he would say things like, this is why we need to have school vouchers. It's kind of almost the privatization of things, as opposed to them being institutions of the government that serve society. Now, he wrote a book, A Theory of Consumption Function, and also one called Capitalism and Freedom, and they're both very good books, and kind of talks about his philosophy, but he's considered, for lack of a better term, the father of the Chicago School of Economics. And from that, monetarism grew from Milton Friedman's thinking from the Chicago School of Economics, and that involved more things like, because their government was growing so big that he believed that the monetary supply need to be something that was controlled, that had slow growth, that had price stability, which then led to also the supply side economics. And that primarily you hear from today from people like Larry Kudlow and Art Laffer, and what they're all about is deregulation and tax cuts, and you'll hear Larry Kudlow on Fox Business talk about that quite a bit, whereas most of the other channels you're going to get a Keynesian view of things. And the supply side economics, there was a book by Richard Fink called Supply Side Economics, and also a person that Larry Kudlow has on quite a bit is Art Laffer, who wrote a book called The Foundations of Supply Side Economics, and you'll hear about the Laffer curve and a number of things like that. But that's primarily their thinking is around deregulation and tax cuts, and you'll hear them talk about it quite a bit. Now, from that came what was known for a while as new neoclassical synthesis, and it was a kind of a hodgepodge of stuff, and then of classical economics, monetarism, and Keynesian, and then it later became the new Keynesian economics. And this is where I was talking about at the beginning, where everything is kind of, it's becoming a melting pot of theories because not one in particular, nobody can prove anything. So, Keynesian policies are primarily what we will see from Democrats, and more of the Chicago School with supply side economics, monetarism, some combination of things that you see coming from Republicans, and then you have the libertarians that will be primarily Austrian economics. So those are kind of the three dominant fields today. And like I said, you talk to any economist, and you're going to get some view. In other words, for instance, Thomas Sowell would be considered from the Chicago School of Economics, but he also likes some of the things that the Austrians are saying in there. And I think if you talk to different economists, they have a tendency to bleed over into other areas. So that is, I think, really what I wanted to cover. Now, why am I covering this? Well, the reason being is you're going to come up with an investing strategy. You want to kind of realize, who's pulling the strings in government, because government and the Fed, and which I'll save for a different video, but really control a lot of what's happening in the economy. And if you're going to be investing, understanding some of the concepts that are out there and what potentially could be happening big picture that can affect your investing. We have, as part of the Keynesian model, you have something called MMT, which is modern monetary theory. And modern monetary theory comes from a person by the name of Stephanie Kelton and others that preceded her. But more, you're going to hear from Stephanie Kelton now, that you can just print as much money, and I'm overstating this, but pretty much print as much money as you want, or increase the money supply as much as you want, and it won't affect things like inflation. And those are some of the battles that are going on in today's world. Now, the interesting thing that you'll see is that even the communist countries have adopted some capitalist, or I guess you might call either Austrian or classical economics portions within the way they run their economies now. Not totally, but they've kind of moved from this kind of communist mindset more towards the capitalist mindset, and the capitalists seem to be moving more towards the socialists. So I don't know if we're converging on something or what's happening, but it's the economists are, to me, they are like the people that do the weather. It is you can't ever prove any of their theories. They can reference a piece here or a piece there, but in my opinion, they can never prove it. All I can see is the result, really, is what's happening, and it's one of those things that affects so many people. But develop your narrative around, because obviously not only the way that you vote, which theory makes most sense to you from an economic standpoint has to be figured in there somewhat with regards to the way that you pull the lever on election day. And it also, like I said, will impact your investing. And it's the whole concept of understanding economics theories is to make you a better investor, which leads to my basically ending motto, which is there's always a better way. And I'll catch you in the next video.